The harmattan wind swept across the sprawling grounds of Koinonia Global, carrying with it the dust of ancient Kaduna soil and the whispered prayers of thousands. Under the vast canopy of the Nigerian sky, where baobab trees stood as sentinels of time, the faithful had gathered for what would become a day etched in memory, a day when the sacred met the profane, when humility wrestled with pride, and when the ancestors' wisdom would speak through the most unexpected vessel. Oya bona bona, let the fire burn, the praise singers chanted, their voices weaving through the morning air like threads of gold in a master weaver's loom. The compound buzzed with anticipation, for Apostle Joshua Selman was to speak that morning, a man whose words carried the weight of mountains and whose presence commanded reverence from Lagos to Maiduguri. But among the sea of believers sat Mama Adunni Okafor, her ankara wrapper blazing with indigo patterns that seemed to dance with each breath she took. Her geli was tied with the precision of a Yoruba queen, each fold a testament to her dignity, each twist a declaration of her worth. Yet beneath the regal exterior burned something else, a fire that had been stoked by years of watching, listening, and questioning what she saw in the house of God. "Elegimere, give me strength," she whispered in Yoruba, her fingers worrying the wooden beads around her wrist, beads carved by her great-grandmother's hands, beads that had seen the rise and fall of empires, the coming of the white man's religion, and the birth of a new Africa struggling to remember its roots while embracing its future. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the corrugated iron roofs of the surrounding communities in shades of copper and gold. From where Mama Adunni sat, she could see the contrast, the gleaming white walls of the ministry complex against the humble mud brick houses of the local community, where children played with bottle caps and old tires, their laughter a symphony of resilience that had echoed across generations. Apostle Joshua Selman emerged onto the platform, his presence immediately commanding attention. Tall and dignified, with the bearing of one who had wrestled with angels and emerged blessed, he carried himself with the confidence of divine appointment. His white agbada flowed like water, and when he spoke, his voice carried the rhythmic cadence of one trained in the ancient art of oratory. "My beloved family in Christ," he began, his words rolling like thunder across the gathering, "today we speak of prosperity, of the inheritance that belongs to the children of the Most High. We speak of your breakthrough, your elevation, your divine positioning in this season of favor." The crowd erupted in agreement, hands raised toward heaven, voices lifted in tongues and testimony. But Mama Adunni remained seated, her keen eyes observing, her spirit discerning. She had heard such words before, words that promised much but seemed to require even more in return. As the apostle continued his message, weaving scriptures with personal revelations, speaking of seed offerings and partnership with the ministry, Mama Adunni felt something stir within her. Not the Holy Spirit that others claimed to feel, but something deeper, older, more primal. It was the voice of her ancestors, the wisdom of women who had survived famines and wars, who had built kingdoms with their bare hands and defended their children with their dying breath. "For your breakthrough to manifest," the apostle declared, his voice rising with conviction, "you must prove your faith through your giving. The windows of heaven open only for those who demonstrate their trust through sacrificial offerings. Tonight, we're believing God for 100 partners who will sow a seed of 50,000 naira. This is not about money, this is about your miracle." Something snapped within Mama Adunni's chest like a dry twig underfoot. She thought of Mama Kemi, her neighbor, who had sold her only gold jewelry last month to sow a seed for her son's healing. A son who still lay sick in the local clinic because they couldn't afford proper medical care. She thought of Brother Tund, who had given his last savings for a breakthrough offering, while his children went to bed hungry. She thought of the widows who gave their pension money, believing that their sacrifice would multiply back to them, only to grow poorer while the ministry grew richer. The rhythm of her heartbeat began to match the ancient talking drums of her people, bim bim bim, calling her to action, to truth, to the courage that had flowed in her bloodline since the first Okafor woman stood up to an unjust chief and spoke truth to power. "Oya, enough." The words erupted from her lips before she could stop them, her voice cutting through the apostle's message like a machete through thick bush. The sound system caught her words and amplified them across the vast gathering, causing thousands of heads to turn in her direction. Apostle Joshua Selman paused mid-sentence, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found her. This woman in resplendent ankara, standing tall among the seated masses, her presence commanding attention despite her lack of microphone or platform. "Sister, we are in service," the apostle said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "If you have a testimony, we can hear it at the appropriate time." But Mama Adunni was no longer just a woman in the crowd, she had become a vessel for something greater, a voice for the voiceless, a flame that refused to be dimmed. She stepped into the aisle, her wrapper swaying with each determined step, her geli standing proud as a crown upon her head. "Apostle," she called out, her voice strong and clear, trained by years of market haggling and community organizing, "I have something to say, and it cannot wait for your appropriate time. Our people are suffering while you promise them miracles for money. Where is the Jesus who fed the 5,000 without asking for an offering first?" A gasp swept through the congregation like wind through grass. Never had anyone seen such boldness in the presence of a man of God. Some muttered prayers for the woman's soul, others whispered that she must be mad or possessed. But Mama Adunni stood her ground, her bare feet planted firmly on the earth of her ancestors, drawing strength from the very soil that had nurtured kingdoms and raised warriors. The apostle studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. In that silence, the entire gathering seemed to hold its breath. Children stopped fidgeting, mothers stopped fanning themselves, even the birds in the nearby trees seemed to pause their songs. "What is your name, daughter?" Apostle Joshua Selman asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I am Adunni Okafor," she replied, her chin lifted with dignity, "daughter of Mama Folake Okafor, granddaughter of Chief Adebayo Okafor, great-granddaughter of Aya Agba Okafor, who stood before the British colonial master and told him that our land was not for sale. I carry their blood, their wisdom, and their courage to speak truth even in the face of power." The genealogy rolled off her tongue like an ancient praise poem, each name a link in an unbroken chain of strength, each generation a testament to the resilience of her people. As she spoke, some in the crowd began to remember their own lineages, their own stories of ancestors who had stood for something greater than themselves. "I come here every Sunday," Mama Adunni continued, her voice gaining momentum like a river in flood season, "and I watch as our brothers and sisters empty their pockets believing that God's love can be purchased. I see the widow giving her last kobo while her children's school fees remain unpaid. I see the sick man borrowing money to sow a seed while he cannot afford the medicine that would heal him. Tell me, Apostle, is this the gospel that Jesus preached?" The apostle's security team began to move forward, but he raised a hand to stop them. Something in the woman's words, in her bearing, in the very authority with which she spoke, gave him pause. Perhaps it was the Spirit, perhaps it was wisdom, perhaps it was simply the recognition that some moments in life demand more than the usual responses. "Speak, daughter," he said, his voice carrying across the silent gathering. "Let us hear what the Lord has laid upon your heart." Mama Adunni felt the shift in the atmosphere, the way the very air seemed to thicken with anticipation. She thought of her grandmother's stories, told by firelight under the vast African sky, stories of how the ancestors would speak through those chosen to carry their wisdom forward. "Apostle, you are gifted, this I do not deny," she began, her voice taking on the rhythm of the traditional praise singers. "Your words carry power, your prayers move mountains. But power without compassion becomes oppression. Knowledge without love becomes manipulation. You stand here in fine clothes, driving expensive cars, living in beautiful houses, while those who finance your lifestyle struggle to feed their families." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the congregation, seeing in their faces the stories she knew by heart, the hope mixed with desperation, the faith tinged with fear, the love for God complicated by the demands of those who claim to represent Him. "Where I come from," she continued, "the elders teach that a true leader eats last, not first. A true shepherd protects the sheep even unto death. He does not shear them bare and leave them naked in the cold. You speak of prosperity, but whose prosperity? You speak of breakthroughs, but for whom?" The wind picked up, rustling through the mango trees that bordered the compound, and in that sound, some swore they could hear the whispers of the ancestors, voices that had guided their people through centuries of triumph and trial, voices that spoke now through this unlikely prophet in ankara cloth. "I have traveled this land from the cassava farms of Ogun to the groundnut pyramids of Kano," Mama Adunni declared, her voice rising and falling with the natural rhythm of a born storyteller. "I have seen the real miracles, the farmer who shares his harvest with the hungry, the teacher who uses her own money to buy books for students, the doctor who treats the poor without payment. These are the ones who truly walk in Christ's footsteps." Apostle Joshua Selman listened, his expression grave, his hands clasped behind his back. Around them, the congregation sat in unprecedented silence, some weeping quietly, others nodding their heads in recognition of truths they had felt but could never articulate. "You quote the scripture about tithing," Mama Adunni continued, "but you forget the scripture about justice rolling down like waters. You speak of the prosperity of Abraham, but you forget that Abraham was called the friend of God because he interceded for the wicked cities, because he showed hospitality to strangers, because his heart was wide enough to encompass all people. Her voice began to take on the cadence of the ancient griots, those keeper of stories who had preserved the wisdom of Africa through oral tradition. Listen, my people, listen well, to the stories that our elders tell, of prophets who came not for gold, but for souls that were precious to behold. They lived among the poor and sick, their miracles were not a trick, they asked for nothing but faith pure, their love for God was strong and sure. Apostle Joshua Selman stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Mama Adunni's face. In her words, he heard echoes of his own journey, the young man who had started with nothing but a passion for souls, who had preached under trees and in borrowed halls, who had once understood intimately the struggles of those he now served. Sister Adunni, he said, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before, you speak with the authority of one who has suffered, who has seen, who has wrestled with questions that many are afraid to ask. Tell me, what would you have me do? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with possibility and pregnant with consequence. Mama Adunni felt the collective breath of the gathering, the weight of their hopes and fears, their desperate need for answers, for healing, for a way forward that honored both their faith and their dignity. First, she said, her voice softening but losing none of its strength, remember where you came from. Remember the young man who preached with holes in his shoes and fire in his heart. That fire was pure because it asked for nothing but the chance to serve God and His people. She began to walk closer to the platform, her steps measured and deliberate, each one carrying her deeper into a moment that would define not just this service, but potentially the direction of a ministry that influenced thousands. Second, look at your congregation, really look at them. See the mother who brought her sick child hoping for healing but who will be made to feel unfaithful if she cannot give the required offering. See the young man who wants to serve God but has been taught that his poverty disqualifies him from God's favor. See the elder who has faithfully tithed for decades but still struggles to make ends meet. As Mama Adunni spoke, something remarkable began to happen in the congregation. People began to look at each other, really see each other, perhaps for the first time. The wealthy businessman in the front row noticed the calloused hands of the mechanic sitting nearby. The elegantly dressed woman saw the worn shoes of the single mother beside her. The young professional felt the quiet dignity of the elderly farmer who had walked miles to attend the service. You see, Apostle, Mama Adunni continued, now standing at the foot of the platform, her voice carrying the weight of generations, the people have not lost faith in God. They have lost faith in those who claim to speak for God but whose lifestyles contradict God's heart for the poor and oppressed. She raised her hand, and her wooden bracelets caught the sunlight, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. My great-grandmother used to say that the spirits of our ancestors weep when their children forget who they are. Today, I believe the Spirit of Christ weeps when His church forgets who He was. A man who owned nothing, who touched the untouchable, who made the wealthy uncomfortable and the poor feel valued. Apostle Joshua Selman stepped down from the platform, moving toward this woman who had disrupted his service but perhaps awakened his conscience. As he approached, Mama Adunni did not step back or lower her gaze. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes with the fearless honesty of one who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Sister, he said, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to every corner of the silent gathering, you have spoken hard truths today. But I ask you, what is the solution? How do we feed the people? How do we spread the gospel? How do we build the kingdom without resources? Mama Adunni smiled then, the first time since she had stood to speak, and in that smile was the warmth of 1,000 hearth fires, the comfort of a mother's embrace, the wisdom of ages distilled into a moment of pure grace. My son, she said, and the tenderness in her voice surprised everyone including herself, the resources have always been there. They are in the hearts of your people, in their willingness to serve, in their desire to be part of something greater than themselves. But you have been trying to extract from them what was always meant to be given freely. She gestured toward the congregation, her hand moving like a blessing over the upturned faces. Look at them, these farmers, these traders, these mothers, these fathers. They have skills, talents, time, energy, creativity. Instead of asking them to empty their pockets, why not ask them to empty their hearts in service? Instead of requiring their money, why not release their potential? The idea began to take shape as she spoke, painting a picture of ministry that looked radically different from what they had known. The mechanic could maintain vehicles for the ministry and train others in his trade. The seamstress could make clothes for the orphans and teach young women a skill. The farmer could share his knowledge and help feed the hungry. The teacher could educate the children and train others to teach. Everyone has something to give that is more valuable than money, they have themselves. Apostle Joshua Selman felt something shift within his chest, like the movement of tectonic plates deep beneath the earth. The woman's words were unlocking something that had been buried under years of institutional thinking, under the pressure to build and expand and compete with other ministries for resources and recognition. "Continue, sister," he said, and there was something different in his voice now, a humility that reminded those who had known him longest of the young man who had first answered the call to ministry. "When Jesus sent out the disciples," Mama Adunni continued, her voice taking on the teaching rhythm of the traditional storytellers, "he told them to take nothing with them, no money, no bag, no extra clothes. Yet they came back rejoicing because they had everything they needed. Why? Because they learned to depend on God and on the hospitality of the people they served." She paused, allowing the implications to settle over the gathering like dew on morning grass. What if this ministry became known not for how much it could take from the people, but for how much it could give? What if instead of building bigger buildings, we built stronger communities? What if instead of raising more money we raised up more leaders? The vision she painted was revolutionary in its simplicity, radical in its return to the roots of what the church was meant to be. Around the compound, people began to lean forward, their imaginations caught by possibilities they had never considered. Brother Tund, the same man who had given his last savings months before, felt something stir within him. He was a skilled carpenter, trained by his father who had learned from his father before him. What if his hands, which had always built for others, could build for the kingdom? What if his skills were the seed offering God was actually asking for? Mama Kemi, still wearing the simple wrapper she had bought to replace the gold jewelry she had sold, remembered that she was known throughout her community as the woman who could heal with herbs, who could midwife difficult births, who could counsel troubled marriages. What if these gifts were more valuable than any monetary offering she could give? Young Samuel, fresh out of university but unemployed, felt a spark of hope as he realized that his education in computer science could be exactly what the ministry needed to reach more people, to organize more effectively, to multiply impact in ways that money alone never could. "You see," Mama Adunni said as if she could read the thoughts rippling through the crowd, "God never needed our money. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. What he has always wanted is our hearts, our dedication, our willingness to be his hands and feet in a broken world." Apostle Joshua Selman stood in the growing silence, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, the expectation of thousands of hearts waiting to see how he would respond to this unprecedented challenge. In the distance, he could hear the call to prayer from the nearby mosque, the sound of children playing in the streets, the everyday rhythms of life continuing beyond the walls of his ministry compound. He thought of his own journey, the nights he had spent in prayer, asking God for direction, for wisdom, for the grace to shepherd the flock he had been given. He thought of the scriptures that had shaped his calling, the mentors who had poured into his life, the moments of divine encounter that had convinced him beyond doubt that he was called to serve. But he also thought of the subtle ways that success had changed him, the gradual shift from servant to celebrity, from shepherd to showman. He thought of the last time he had sat in a mud brick house sharing a simple meal with struggling believers, the last time he had prayed with someone who had nothing to offer but their tears and their trust. "Sister Adunni," he said finally, his voice carrying a new note of resolve, "you have held up a mirror today and I do not like everything I see in it. But I believe you have been sent by God to call us back to our true purpose." He turned to address the full congregation, his arms spread wide in a gesture that seemed to embrace them all. "My beloved family, today we have heard a word that challenges us, that confronts us, that calls us to be better than we have been. I believe God has spoken through our sister, and we must listen with hearts that are ready to change." What happened next would be remembered for generations as the moment when Koinonia Global redefined what it meant to be a community of faith. Apostle Joshua Selman, humbled by the truth spoken by a woman in ankara cloth, made a public commitment that stunned everyone present. "From this day forward," he declared, his voice strong with conviction, "this ministry will be known not for what it takes from you, but for what it gives to you and through you to the world. We will no longer measure success by the size of our offerings but by the depth of our impact. We will no longer build monuments to our ministry but movements of transformation in our communities." The changes he announced were radical and immediate. No more required seed offerings or partnership fees. Establishment of skill training centers where members could learn trades and crafts. Creation of microlending programs to help members start small businesses. Organization of community gardens to address food insecurity. Launch of free medical clinics staffed by volunteer healthcare professionals from the congregation. Development of scholarship programs funded not by special offerings but by members who chose to redirect their giving toward education. And Sister Adunni, he said, turning back to the woman who had sparked this transformation, "I ask you to join our leadership team, to help us stay accountable to this vision, to be the voice that keeps us connected to the heart of our community." The response was immediate and overwhelming. People began standing throughout the congregation, not in the choreographed way of a typical church service, but in the organic movement of hearts that had been touched, minds that had been changed, spirits that had been set free. Brother Tun stood up. "Apostle, I am a carpenter. I volunteer to train others and to build homes for the homeless in our community." Mama Kemi rose to her feet. "I am a traditional healer and midwife. I will work with the medical clinic to provide healthcare that honors both modern medicine and traditional wisdom." Young Samuel raised his hand. "I am a computer programmer. I will build systems to help coordinate our community programs and connect with other ministries doing similar work." One by one, throughout the vast gathering, people began to declare not what they would give monetarily, but what they would contribute through their skills, their time, their talents, their passion. The atmosphere crackled with an energy that was entirely different from the usual religious fervor. This was the excitement of people discovering their purpose, their value, their place in something greater than themselves. As the declarations continued, something supernatural began to happen. The same spirit that had moved through the early church, when believers shared all things in common and no one lacked anything, began to move through the gathering. But it was not the theatrical spirituality often associated with prosperity gospel meetings. This was deeper, quieter, more profound. Mama Adunni felt it first, a warmth that began in her chest and spread throughout her body, a sense of connection not just to the people around her but to the generations that had come before, to the ancestors who had prayed for a day when their children would walk in both power and humility, in both faith and wisdom. "Ancestors, you see this day," she whispered in Yoruba, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Your prayers have been answered. Your children remember who they are." The apostle felt it too, a return of the anointing he had known in his early days of ministry, when everything was simple and pure and focused solely on serving God and loving people. It was as if layers of institutional thinking and commercial Christianity were being peeled away, revealing the true heart of the gospel that had captured his imagination so many years before. Throughout the congregation, people were experiencing something they had longed for but could never quite name, the sense of being truly seen, truly valued, truly part of a community that existed not to use them but to empower them, not to extract from them but to invest in them. Over the following hours, as the service extended far beyond its scheduled time, the practical implications of this transformation began to take shape. Working groups formed spontaneously as people with complementary skills found each other and began to envision collaborative projects. The farmers gathered with the business owners to discuss the creation of a cooperative that would provide fresh produce to the community at affordable prices while ensuring fair wages for the growers. The teachers connected with the parents to plan expanded educational programs that would serve not just the children of church members but all the children in the surrounding neighborhoods. The healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, traditional healers and community health workers, began to outline a comprehensive wellness program that would address not just physical health but mental, emotional and spiritual well-being. The artists and craftspeople started planning cultural programs that would preserve and celebrate their heritage while generating income for families. "You see what happens," Mama Adunni said to Apostle Joshua Selman as they watched the organic organization taking place around them, "when you trust the people, when you believe in their capacity to be solutions rather than just sources of support?" As the sun began to set over Kaduna, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to reflect the transformation that had taken place that day, Apostle Joshua Selman called for a moment of reflection and commitment. "My family," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering that had swelled throughout the day as word spread through the community about what was happening at Koinonia Global, "today we have witnessed something that I believe will be remembered as a turning point not just for our ministry, but for what it means to be the church in Africa, in Nigeria, in our generation." He gestured toward Mama Adunni, who stood nearby, her ankara wrapper now dusty from the day's activities but her dignity undiminished, her presence somehow having grown even more commanding as the hours had passed. "Sister Adunni came here today not to destroy but to rebuild, not to tear down but to restore. She reminded us that the power of the gospel is not in what it can extract from people but in what it can release within people. She called us back to our true identity as servants, as shepherds, as family." The crowd responded with a sound that was part agreement, part celebration, part relief, the sound of people who had found their way home after a long journey through foreign territory. What followed was unprecedented in the history of the ministry. Instead of an altar call for salvation or blessing, Apostle Joshua Selman issued an invitation for commitment. not to financial giving but to community transformation. If you are ready to be part of this new covenant, he said, this commitment to serve rather than be served, to give of yourselves rather than just your money, to be the church that Jesus envisioned rather than the institution we have become, then come forward. The response was overwhelming. People streamed forward, not in the emotional rush often seen in religious gatherings, but with the steady determination of those who have found their purpose. Young and old, rich and poor, educated and unschooled, they came to pledge themselves to a vision that honored both their faith and their dignity. As they gathered around the platform, Mama Adunni began to sing, not a contemporary worship song, but an ancient Yoruba praise chant that her grandmother had taught her, a song that celebrated the power of community, the strength that comes from unity, the blessings that flow when people work together for the common good. Others joined in, adding their own languages and melodies to create a symphony of praise that rose toward heaven like incense, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of a people who had rediscovered their voice, their value, their vision for the future. As the formal service finally came to an end and people began to make their way home through the gathering darkness, there was a sense that something profound had shifted, not just in the ministry but in the very DNA of the community. Conversations continued in small groups throughout the compound, as people exchanged contact information, made plans for follow-up meetings and committed to staying connected to the work that had begun. Mama Adunni found herself surrounded by people who wanted to thank her, to ask her questions, to understand more about the vision she had articulated. But she deflected the attention with the wisdom of one who understood that true leadership is about empowering others, not accumulating followers. The vision is not mine, she said repeatedly, it belongs to all of us. It is the dream of our ancestors, the hope of our children, the calling of our generation. We are simply the ones chosen to make it real. Apostle Joshua Selman approached her as the crowd began to thin, his expression a mixture of gratitude, humility, and determination. Sister, I want to thank you, he said, not just for what you said today but for how you said it. You could have been harsh, condemning, destructive. Instead, you were firm but loving, challenging but constructive. You showed me what it looks like to speak truth in love. Mama Adunni studied his face in the fading light, seeing in it the sincerity that had convinced her to trust him with her challenge, to believe that he was capable of the transformation she was calling for. Apostle, she replied, the test of today's commitment will not be in the excitement of this moment, but in the daily choice to live differently, to lead differently, to be the church that serves rather than the church that is served. Are you ready for that kind of change? The story of what happened that day at Koinonia Global spread far beyond Kaduna, carried by social media, word of mouth, and the testimonies of those who had witnessed the transformation. Other ministries began to examine their own practices, asking hard questions about the relationship between faith and finance, between prosperity and purpose, between success and service. Mama Adunni returned to her simple home in the community, but she was no longer just a member of the congregation. She had become a catalyst for change, a voice for transformation, a bridge between the wisdom of the ancestors and the hope of the future. The phone calls and visitors that followed were testament to the hunger that existed throughout Nigeria and beyond for a Christianity that honored both the divine and the human, both the spiritual and the practical. Apostle Joshua Selman faced his own challenges as he worked to implement the changes he had committed to. There were board members who questioned the financial implications, partners who worried about the sustainability of the new model, critics who suggested that the whole thing was an emotional reaction rather than a strategic decision. But every time doubt crept in, he remembered the look in Mama Adunni's eyes when she had challenged him, the sound of her voice when she had spoken of ancestors who wept for children who had forgotten who they were, the feeling of rightness that had settled over him when he had made his commitment to change. Months later, as the new programs took root and began to bear fruit, the transformation was undeniable. The community around Koinonia Global began to thrive in ways that went far beyond what any amount of monetary giving could have achieved. Unemployment dropped as people learned new skills and started small businesses. Health outcomes improved as the community clinic provided both modern and traditional healthcare. Children's educational performance soared as the expanded programs addressed not just academic needs but also nutrition and family support. But perhaps most importantly, the people themselves were different. There was a dignity in their bearing, a confidence in their voices, a sense of ownership and investment that had been missing before. They were no longer just consumers of religious services. They had become co-creators of community transformation. The ripple effects continued to spread. Other churches began to adopt similar models. Community organizations took notice of the collaborative approach. Government officials started to see the ministry as a partner in development rather than just another religious institution asking for support. And through it all, Mama Adunni remained a quiet but powerful presence, serving on the leadership team that oversaw the transformation, mentoring other women who were finding their voices, and continuing to speak truth with the fearless love that had changed everything that day when she stood up in service and refused to be silent. As she sat on her veranda one evening, watching the sun set over a community that was visibly different from the one she had known just a year before, Mama Adunni reflected on the mystery of how God uses ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. She thought of her great-grandmother, who had stood before colonial officials and defended her people's land. She thought of her grandmother, who had preserved the old stories and wisdom through decades of change. She thought of her mother, who had taught her that a woman's voice, when raised in truth and love, could move mountains. Aya Agba, she whispered to the gathering darkness, using the Yoruba term for great-grandmother, "You see what we have done." The chain continues. The legacy lives. The changes at Koinonia Global had become more than just a ministry transformation. They had become a testament to the power of authentic faith, community wisdom, and the courage to challenge even sacred institutions when they lose their way. The story was being told in villages and cities across Africa, inspiring other communities to examine their own relationships with power, prosperity, and purpose. And somewhere in the eternal realm where the ancestors dwell, where the spirits of the faithful gather to watch over their children, there was celebration, not just for what had been accomplished, but for what had been remembered, what had been restored, what had been revealed about the true nature of faith, community, and service. The woman who had publicly challenged Apostle Joshua Selman had indeed shocked him, not with insult or disrespect, but with the power of truth spoken in love, with the wisdom of generations distilled into a moment of divine confrontation, with the reminder that the gospel is not about building empires but about transforming hearts, communities, and the world itself. In the end, both the challenger and the challenged had been changed, and through their willingness to embrace difficult truth and transformative change, thousands of others found their way back to a faith that honored both heaven and earth, both the divine calling and the human struggle. 3 years had passed since that pivotal day, and the transformation had taken on a life of its own. What had begun as a single woman's courageous confrontation had evolved into a movement that was reshaping not just one ministry, but the entire landscape of faith-based community development in West Africa. The Koinonia model, as it had come to be known, was being studied by universities, replicated by other ministries, and adapted by community organizations across the continent. But for Mama Adunni, the real victory was not in the acclaim or recognition. It was in the faces of the children who now had access to quality education, the families who had climbed out of poverty through the cooperative programs, the young adults who had discovered their gifts and were using them to serve others. Dr. Amara Osei, a researcher from the University of Ghana who had come to study the Koinonia transformation, sat with Mama Adunni under the same mango tree where she had often prayed before that fateful confrontation. "Mama Adunni," Dr. Osei said, her notebook filled with observations and interviews, "what you accomplished here challenges everything we thought we knew about religious leadership, community development, and social change. How did you know it would work?" Mama Adunni smiled, her eyes crinkling with the wisdom of someone who had lived through both struggle and triumph. "Sister, I did not know it would work. I only knew it had to be tried. Sometimes the ancestors give us courage not because the path is clear, but because the path is necessary." The story had indeed traveled far beyond Nigeria's borders. Delegations had come from Kenya, where similar prosperity gospel challenges were being questioned. Visitors arrived from Ghana, South Africa, and even the Caribbean, where descendants of enslaved Africans were reconnecting with indigenous wisdom traditions while maintaining their Christian faith. Pastor Michael Thompson from Kingston, Jamaica, had spent 2 weeks observing the programs at Koinonia Global. On his final day, he sought out Mama Adunni for a private conversation. "Mama," he said, using the respectful term he had learned during his stay, "what you did here, it speaks to something we've been feeling in our churches too. The people are tired of being treated like ATM machines for the kingdom. They want to be partners, not just payers." Mama Adunni nodded, recognizing in his words the same hunger for authentic faith that had driven her to stand up that day. "Brother Michael, the Spirit of God is moving across the waters, calling us back to what we were always meant to be. The question is not whether change will come, the question is whether we will be part of it or resist it." The transformation at Koinonia Global had sent shockwaves through theological seminaries and denominational headquarters across Africa and the diaspora. Some criticized the changes as a departure from biblical prosperity principles. Others hailed it as a return to authentic gospel values. The debate raged in conferences, academic journals, and social media platforms. But Apostle Joshua Selman had found peace in the storm. Standing before the African Council of Church Leaders in Accra, Ghana, he delivered what many considered the most important theological address of his career. My colleagues, we have been asking the wrong question. We have been asking, how can we get more from our people? When we should have been asking, how can we give more to our people? We have been focused on building bigger buildings when we should have been focused on building stronger communities. We have been preaching prosperity while ignoring poverty, blessing while overlooking brokenness. His words were met with a mixture of applause and controversy, but he continued with the same conviction that had marked his ministry since that day of confrontation. Sister Adunni Okafor taught me that true apostolic authority is not measured by how many people serve you, but by how many people you serve. It is not demonstrated by how much wealth you can accumulate, but by how much transformation you can facilitate. It is not proven by the size of your following, but by the depth of your impact. Perhaps the most profound change was visible in the young people who had grown up during the transformation. Children who had once seen church as a place where their parents gave money they couldn't afford were now teenagers who saw faith as a force for community empowerment and social justice. Kemi Adebayo, now 17, had been 12 when Mama Adunni made her stand. She had watched her own mother, Mama Kemi, go from selling her jewelry for seed offerings to becoming the coordinator of the community health program, using her traditional healing knowledge to complement modern medical care. Now, as Kemi prepared to leave for university on a scholarship funded by the community cooperative, she sought out Mama Adunni for advice and blessing. Mama Adunni, she said, using the term of respect that had become universal in the community, I want to study medicine, but I also want to learn more about our traditional healing practices. I want to bridge the two worlds, like you did with challenging the church while respecting the faith. Mama Adunni placed her hands on the young woman's head, feeling the continuation of something that had begun generations before and would continue long after she was gone. My daughter, you carry within you the wisdom of your ancestors and the hope of your descendants. Study hard, learn much, but never forget that the greatest healing comes not from medicine alone, but from communities that care for each other, that see every person as valuable, that refuse to let anyone be left behind. The success of the Koinonia model had not gone unnoticed by the established religious hierarchy. Some denominational leaders had quietly begun to implement similar programs, while others had doubled down on traditional prosperity gospel messages, seeing the transformation as a threat to their own authority and financial base. Bishop Cornelius Adeyemi, one of Nigeria's most prominent prosperity gospel teachers, had requested a private meeting with Apostle Joshua Selman. The two men sat in the bishop's opulent office in Lagos, surrounded by symbols of wealth and success that seemed to belong to a different era. Joshua, Bishop Adeyemi said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, what you're doing is admirable, but it's not sustainable. How do you build? How do you expand? How do you compete with other ministries if you're not collecting substantial offerings? Apostle Joshua Selman looked around the ornate office, remembering the simple homes he had visited in the past week, the faces of children who were now attending school because their parents were earning sustainable incomes through the cooperative programs. Bishop, he replied, I think we've been defining success by the wrong metrics. We've been measuring buildings instead of transformed lives, counting money instead of changed communities. The sustainability you're asking about, it's not in the offerings we collect, it's in the people we empower. Mama Adunni's courage had inspired a generation of African women to find their voices in spaces that had traditionally silenced them. The Adunni effect, as some called it, was visible in churches, mosques, and traditional religious gatherings across the continent. In Kampala, Uganda, Mama Sarah Nakamura had challenged her pastor about the church's treatment of single mothers. In Dakar, Senegal, Awa Diop had questioned why women were expected to fund church programs but excluded from leadership decisions. In Nairobi, Kenya, Mary Wanjiku had organized a group of market women to demand accountability from religious leaders who lived in luxury while their congregants struggled. These women often cited Mama Adunni's example, not as something to copy exactly, but as proof that ordinary women could speak extraordinary truth to power when they drew on the wisdom of their ancestors and the courage of their convictions. Sister Helen Mwangi, a theologian at the University of Nairobi, had written extensively about this phenomenon. What Mama Adunni demonstrated is that African women have always been the keepers of both spiritual wisdom and practical knowledge. When we silence women in our religious institutions, we silence the voice of God speaking through half of humanity. The cooperative programs that had grown out of that day of confrontation had created a new model of faith-based economic development. The Koinonia Community Bank, established with funds redirected from building projects, was providing microloans to members at rates that commercial banks couldn't match. The agricultural cooperative was not only feeding the community but generating surplus income that supported other programs. Professor Chinua Akwu, an economist at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, had studied the Koinonia model extensively. His research showed that communities that adopted similar approaches saw significant improvements in key development indicators. Child mortality rates dropped, school enrollment increased, women's economic participation rose, and social cohesion strengthened. What we're seeing here, Professor Akwu explained to a gathering of development professionals, is what happens when you combine traditional African communal values with progressive economic principles and authentic spiritual motivation. It's not charity, it's empowerment. It's not dependency, it's development. The transformation had also sparked a cultural renaissance in the community. The emphasis on honoring ancestral wisdom while embracing progressive values had led to a flowering of art, music, literature, and traditional practices that had been suppressed or forgotten. Young people were learning traditional crafts from elders, not as museum pieces but as living traditions that could generate income and preserve cultural identity. The community center hosted regular cultural events where traditional praise songs were combined with contemporary worship music, where ancient proverbs were shared alongside modern testimonies. Adebola Fashina, a cultural anthropologist who had documented this renaissance, observed, "What Mama Adunni did was give the community permission to be fully African and fully Christian, to embrace their heritage while living their faith. This integration is producing a form of spirituality that is both deeply rooted and authentically contemporary." The community health program had become a model for holistic healthcare that integrated traditional healing practices with modern medical knowledge. Mama Kemi, now known as the Community Health Coordinator, had trained a network of women who could provide basic health care, teach preventive medicine, and refer serious cases to the clinic. Dr. Fatima Abdullahi, a physician who volunteered at the clinic, had initially been skeptical of incorporating traditional healing practices. But 3 years of collaboration had changed her perspective entirely. "I've learned that many of our traditional remedies have real therapeutic value," she explained to a group of medical students who were studying the program. "But more importantly, I've learned that healing is not just about treating disease, it's about restoring wholeness to people, to families, to communities. When we combine the best of both worlds, we get results that neither approach could achieve alone." The community school system had evolved into something unprecedented in Nigerian education. Children learned standard curriculum subjects alongside traditional knowledge, environmental conservation alongside spiritual development, individual achievement alongside community responsibility. Teachers came from the community and were supported by the community, creating an educational environment that reflected the values and aspirations of the people being served. Test scores had improved dramatically, but more importantly, children were graduating with a sense of identity, purpose, and connection to their heritage. Ngozi Okoro, the principal of the community primary school, reflected on the changes. "Before, we were trying to educate children to leave their community to seek success elsewhere. Now we're educating them to transform their community to be successful here. The difference is profound." Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the transformation was the deepening of spiritual life that had occurred as the focus shifted from financial giving to personal contribution. Prayer meetings were more frequent and more earnest. Bible study groups had multiplied as people sought to understand the theological foundations of their new way of living. Young people who had once seen faith as irrelevant were discovering a spirituality that connected with their deepest longings for meaning and purpose. Adults who had felt exploited by religious institutions were experiencing a sense of authentic partnership with the divine. Pastor David Okafor, no relation to Mama Adunni, who served as one of the associate ministers, observed, "When people feel valued rather than used, when they see their gifts recognized rather than just their money counted, something happens in their relationship with God. They stop seeing themselves as subjects of divine favor that can be purchased and start seeing themselves as partners in divine purpose that can be lived." Mama Adunni had become a sought-after mentor for women across Africa who were finding their own voices in religious and community leadership. She received letters, phone calls, and visits from women who shared their stories of speaking truth to power, of challenging unjust practices, of working for transformation in their own contexts. But she was careful to emphasize that each situation was unique, that what had worked in Kaduna might need to be adapted elsewhere, that the principles were transferable but the practices needed to be contextual. "My sisters," she would say to the women who sought her guidance, "I am not your model, I am your sister. We each must find our own way to speak truth in our own places. But we can encourage each other, learn from each other, and remind each other that we are not alone in this work. The Koinonia model had gained international attention, with delegations visiting from development organizations, theological institutions, and government agencies around the world. Awards and recognition had followed, but Mama Adunni and Apostle Joshua Selman had been careful to keep the focus on the community and the principles rather than on personalities. When the World Council of Churches invited them to speak at their assembly in Geneva, they decided to send a delegation that included not just religious leaders but farmers, teachers, healthcare workers, and young people who could speak about the transformation from their own perspectives. The story belongs to all of us, Mama Adunni explained to the delegation before they traveled. Let the world hear from the people whose lives have been changed, not just from those who helped change them. As the 4th anniversary of the transformation approached, the community was already looking toward the future. Plans were underway for a regional conference that would bring together communities from across West Africa to share experiences and learn from each other. The Koinonia Community University, a dream that had emerged from the success of the basic education programs, was preparing to enroll its first students. Unlike traditional universities that extracted the best and brightest from rural communities, this institution was designed to strengthen communities by training local leaders in fields like sustainable agriculture, community health, conflict resolution, and social entrepreneurship. We're not trying to compete with the big universities in Lagos or Abuja, explained Dr. Amina Gabra, who had left her position at a prestigious university to become the founding vice-chancellor. We're trying to offer something different, education that serves the community rather than separating students from their roots. The theological implications of the Koinonia transformation continued to reverberate throughout African Christianity. Seminary curricula were being revised to include courses on community development, economic justice, and cultural integration. Young pastors were being trained not just in preaching and church administration, but in community organizing and social entrepreneurship. The Koinonia Institute for Contextual Theology, established in partnership with several African universities, was producing scholarships that challenged traditional Western-influenced approaches to ministry and missions. The Institute's journal, Rooted Faith, had become required reading in seminaries across the continent. Reverend Dr. Kwame Asante, the Institute's director, wrote in a recent editorial, "What we've learned from Koinonia is that authentic African Christianity doesn't have to choose between spiritual depth and social relevance, between honoring tradition and embracing progress, between serving God and serving community. When we integrate these elements, we discover a form of faith that is both deeply rooted and powerfully transformative." For Mama Adunni personally, the years since her confrontation with Apostle Joshua Selman had been a journey of continual growth and deepening understanding. She had discovered that speaking truth to power was not a one-time act but a way of life, that challenging injustice required constant vigilance and courage. She had also learned the delicate balance between prophetic boldness and pastoral compassion, between confronting systems and caring for people, between demanding change and nurturing relationships. These lessons had made her a more effective leader and a more mature spiritual guide. Sitting in her garden one evening, surrounded by the vegetables she had grown and the medicinal plants she had cultivated, she reflected on the mystery of how God uses ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. The transformation that had begun with her standing up in church had touched thousands of lives and influenced communities across the continent. Yet she remained grounded in the simple truth that had motivated her from the beginning. Faith must be practical, leadership must be service, and the gospel must address the whole person in community context. Despite the remarkable success of the transformation, Mama Adunni knew that the work was far from complete. New challenges emerged regularly: how to maintain the vision as the community grew, how to preserve the values while adapting to changing circumstances, how to replicate the model in different cultural contexts without losing its essence. There were also ongoing tensions with religious establishments that felt threatened by the Koinonia approach, economic pressures as Nigeria's economy faced various challenges, and the constant need to train new leaders who could carry the vision forward. But Mama Adunni faced these challenges with the same combination of ancestral wisdom and prophetic courage that had sustained her from the beginning. She had learned that transformation is not a destination but a journey, not an achievement but a commitment, not a moment but a movement. As she approached her 70th birthday, Mama Adunni often reflected on the larger significance of what had begun with her confrontation of Apostle Joshua Selman. She had come to understand that their encounter had been part of something much larger than either of them, a movement of the Spirit that was calling African Christianity to rediscover its authentic voice and mission. The transformation at Koinonia Global was not just about one ministry or one community, it was about the possibility of a faith that honored both the spiritual and the material, that served both heaven and earth, that integrated the wisdom of the ancestors with the hope of the descendants. In quiet moments, when she felt the presence of her great-grandmother and all the women who had gone before, Mama Adunni knew that she had been faithful to the calling that had been placed upon her life. She had spoken truth in love, challenged power with wisdom, and helped create a model of faith that future generations could build upon. The woman who had once insulted an apostle by demanding authentic Christianity had become a mother of a movement that was transforming communities across Africa. The shock she had delivered was not one of disrespect but of love, not of destruction but of restoration, not of rebellion but of return to the true heart of the gospel. And in the end, both she and Apostle Joshua Selman could testify that God had used their willingness to embrace difficult truth and transformative change to create something beautiful, something lasting, something that honored both the faith they proclaimed and the people they served.